What is up, guys? This is Danny with Plug and Play, and today we're going to be talking about our brand new liquid animation tool called Splash. Splash allows you to create procedurally generated liquid trails and particles with a stupid amount of control. One of the goals of this project was to break down the barrier between After Effects and frame-by-frame animation, and I think that we're there. Whether you just want to jump right in with our many presets or tinker your own custom particles, Splash is sure to moisten up your project. When you first open up Splash, this is the panel that you will be presented with. As you can see, we have a big old blue splash button here in the top left corner, and this is going to be the button that actually triggers creating new splashes on layers. To the right of that, we have a help button, and inside of here you can find information about your licensing, some general instructions, as well as some links to our video tutorial for this product and for our other products as well. To the right of that, we have a quantity input box, and this is what will dictate the amount of splashes that we are generating on a particular layer. Below all of this, we have our preset section, and inside of here you will be able to update a particular layer with that selected preset. You will be able to create new presets, and you will also be able to delete presets. As you can see, we have some preloaded presets that you will be able to play around with as soon as you get your hands on Splash, and you can always add more. Below that, we have the blob section, and we start out with a blob button, and clicking this will generate a blob on the selected layer that we have in our composition. We also have some preliminary properties that we can control before creating the blob, such as this color, as well as the size and stretchiness of the blob. In order to use Splash, we need a moving object inside of our After Effects composition. So right now I have this null object with some position keyframes on it, and it's just doing its little thing, going a bunch of loop-de-loops here in our comp. And let's make sure that we have this layer selected, and let's go to our Splash panel. We can dock this panel if we want to. I'm going to leave it docked over here on the left of our composition viewer. And let's go ahead and make sure that we have the appropriate quantity inputted here. The default is going to be 3 splashes per layer, but we can bump this up to be 10, or we can lower it to be 1. But keep in mind, this is a pretty resource-intensive effect, so I would recommend not really going above, say, 7 splashes per individual layer inside of After Effects. I'm going to leave mine at 3. So once we have our quantity inputted here, we have our layer selected, I can go over to the Splash button and let's click Splash. So as you can see right off the bat, we have 3 splash layers created inside of our After Effects panel, and we also have this new splash effect on our original moving object. You can see inside of the viewer here that we already have some of this beautiful liquid trail goodness going on, and this is all just done in the click of a button. All we needed to have done was to make sure that our original moving object had some movement inside of it, such as position, scale, or rotation. Now if we want to generate a blob on this same moving object, we can go ahead again, make sure that that layer is selected, and let's go over to our blob panel, and we can control different things like the color here. So I'm going to change mine to be maybe green. We can change the size and also the stretchiness. Now let's go ahead and click blob. So as you can see right above that moving object, we now have this blob layer, and on that same moving object we now have another new effect here called blob, which will allow us to control all the different parameters of that blob, just like the splash effect does with the various splash layers. Splash comes with a variety of different presets built in that make it super easy to get off the ground. If you'd like to apply one of these presets to an existing set of splashes, go ahead and select the appropriate preset from the drop-down. Make sure that the original object is selected with the splash effect already applied, and then let's go ahead and hit the update button. Automatically, that set of splashes will be updated, and you'll have easy access to a variety of different effects right off the bat. The blob effect inside of Splash allows us to create this liquid blob effect that elongates and contorts in correlation to the original moving object's speed. So in this case, we are in between 2 keyframes right now where the null object is moving quite quickly, and therefore the blob is stretching itself out here. Now, of course, we can control all of these different parameters on the blob effect, which is located on our original moving object. So if we go to our blob effect here, we can affect things such as the size, the stretch, the blob color, and we can also add a little bit of gravity and change that gravity angle. So if we go to the blob size, we can decrease this to be about 25, and we're going to get a much skinnier looking blob here. Of course, we can do the inverse of that, increase it up to 75, and now we get a big old chunker on our hands, little thick guy. Now, if we go to the blob stretch, this is going to control how far this blob stretches when it is moving throughout the scene. So if we decrease this to be about 25, we're going to get a much shorter tail when the blob is moving quickly. And of course, if we increase this to be, let's say, 100, it's going to get a much longer tail. Now, if we want to go ahead and add some gravity, that it's a very easy thing to do. All we need to do is go into our physics group here, and let's increase this gravity to be about 500. This also pairs very nicely when we start adding gravity to the splash effect, and we can kind of line up how the gravity is working cohesively between the blob and the splash effect. The splash effect, as you can imagine, is the main component of splash. It allows us to generate these liquid trail particles off of a moving object inside of our composition. Once you've gone ahead and you've generated these splash layers via the splash button, go ahead and click on the original moving object, go into its effect controls, and in there you will find the splash effect. Inside of a splash effect, there are a plethora of different properties that we can affect in order to fine-tune this splash trail animation. Let's start off by going over these top 3 properties in the splash effect. We have position spread, position random, and seed. Position spread is what allows us to distribute these various splash effects across the original layer. So we can either set this to be 0, which would mean that all of these splashes, all of these trails would just be in the center of this original object, or we can set this position spread to be 100%, and that means that these various splashes will be distributed over the entire area of that original moving object. So let's go to a point in the timeline where this is just moving straight down to get a better idea of this. So we have it set to 50% right now. If we set this to 0%, we can see that all of these different layers are all going to be distributed at the same point, which is going to be the center of that original moving object. Now, if we set this to be 100%, you can see that we are distributing these splashes across the entire surface area of that original object. Now, this takes us to our second effect here, which is position random. This allows us to add some type of randomness in the distribution position of these splashes. So let's say that we don't want all of these splashes to be evenly distributed across the surface area. We can add some position random that will allow us to give some variability and some randomness to how these are distributed, which will give us a more authentic effect. So if we set this to be 100%, you can see that these splashes are going to be distributed in a very, very random way. Now this takes us to our third property up here, which is the seed. And the seed will control all of the different randomness across all of the different properties inside of the splash effect. So in this case, we have the position random set to 100. If we change the seed to 2 or 11, you can see that we get an entirely new, different position spread. Now, of course, we can keep cycling through these seeds and keep finding various seeds that maybe are more tailored for the effect that we're going for. Now, the seed 95 is giving us a pretty cool effect here, but I'm going to go ahead and drop this position spread back down to 50%, and we'll bring the randomness back down to 20%. Let's go ahead and let's go into this generator group and look at some of the properties in here. All of these properties are going to relate to how these particles are being generated. And inside of here, you will find the time offset, speed threshold, amplitude, initial velocity, inherited velocity, direction randomness, and then we also have a manual direction mode down here, along with some randomness that we can add to these various properties across these different splash layers, just like we did with position random. Speed threshold dictates at what speed we start generating particles at. So if we go ahead and we crank this speed threshold up to be 200, You'll see that we lost some of these earlier particles here, and that's because earlier in the timeline, when this original null object was not moving as quickly, we're not going to be generating as many particles there because we have that higher speed threshold. Now, if we drop this speed threshold to 0, which means that we will always be generating particles regardless of the speed, we will see that we have many more particles here, and that's because we are always generating particles. Time offset allows us to generate these particles trail animations further ahead of time or further behind in time. So if we set this time offset to be -50, you can see that all of these different particles are being generated further behind in time than the original moving object. This is useful if you want to generate these particles off of an object where you don't want the particles immediately behind the object. You want them a little bit further behind. Now, if we go ahead and go into time offset and set this to be +50, you will see that now all of these particles are being generated further ahead of time than that original moving object. Amplitude allows us to control the amount of particles that are being generated on a per second basis. Now, if we drop this to 10, you will see that we have way less particles on the screen, and that's because we are generating way less particles per second. Of course, if we increase this amplitude up to be 80, we're going to have many more particles per second, and therefore many more particles on the screen. Initial velocity and inherited velocity are similar in the fact that they both impact at what velocity these particles are being born with, but they differ in the fact that inherited velocity takes into account the speed of the moving object. So if we go ahead and set this initial velocity to be 0, and we set the inherited velocity to be 60, you'll see that when this moving object is moving quite slower in the timeline, these particles are being born with almost a stagnant velocity. They're barely moving. But when this moving object is moving quite quickly through the scene, you'll see that we have a lot of velocity going on with these different particles. Now, if we go ahead and change this initial velocity to be 60 and change the inherited velocity to be 0, you'll find that regardless of what speed the moving object is moving at, all of these particles are being birthed with the same velocity. Direction randomness allows us to supply a sort of random value in terms of what direction these particles are being born. So if we go ahead and enter in a 50 or something into this direction randomness, you'll see that we no longer have those streaky looking trails that we previously had, and that's because each of these particles are being born with a slightly different direction. Let's take a look at this random group inside of the generator group in here. Inside of the random group, you will find properties for time offset, speed threshold, amplitude, velocity, and direction randomness, where we can add randomness across these individual different splashes. So what does that mean? Well, let's go ahead and let's enter in a time offset of 100. Let's also go ahead in our timeline where this is moving straight down so that we can give a better depiction of what's going on here. So as you can see, these splashes are being generated ahead of our moving object, and that's because we have a time offset. Now, let's go ahead and enter in a value of 100 inside of this time offset random value. So as you can see, some of these particles are offset very much into the future. Some of these particles are offset not as much into the future, and that's because we have a large time offset random here. Now, if we brought this down to 50, you'll see that now the randomness or the time offset of these individual layers are closer together. We're not having as much randomness across these different splashes because we have a smaller random value for the time offset. And that goes the same for all of these different properties inside of this random group, right? If we wanted to add some amplitude randomness, we could put in 50 for amplitude randomness. And now we're going to get a different amplitude level across all of these different splash layers, right? Some of them are going to have a higher amount of amplitude. Some are going to have a lower amount of amplitude. Maybe we didn't want that much variability in terms of our amplitude, so let's drop that down to a lower number such as 10. Now all of these different splashes are going to have a similar amplitude, but they're going to be a little bit different because we have that low amount of randomness. And now this is all being dictated by the seed, right? So if we don't like how this exact randomness is going for us, we can change that seed to be, I don't know, 196. And now we get a completely different looking effect And that's because this seed is affecting the randomness for not only the amplitude random, but also for the time offset random and for the position random. This seed affects the randomness of all of the different random properties inside of Splash. Manual mode allows us to control the exact direction that all of our particles are being born into. So this is useful when creating things such as smoke and fire, where regardless of the direction of the moving object, we are still generating all of those particles upwards or to the side or in whichever direction we want via this direction control. Now that we've covered the generator group, let's go ahead and take a look at the particle group. Inside of here, we're going to find a bunch of different properties that pertain to the individual particles. So things such as the lifespan of the particles, the size randomness, and also the birth and death color of the particles. Just like the generator group, we also have a random group inside of here that allows us to add randomness to the lifespan and also the size of the particles across our various splashes. The lifespan property allows us to dictate how long these individual particles are staying on the screen for. As you can see, the default is set to 2, but if we go ahead and decrease this to 1, you'll see that these particles stay on the screen for much less of a time. And if we keep going down here to 0.5, even more so, we're going to see how little these particles are staying on the screen for. Now, of course, if we bump this back up to even higher than 2, let's call 3, we're going to see these particles last for a long period of time. The size property allows us to affect how big or how small these particles are being born. So the default's 25, and if we go ahead and increase this to 40, you'll see that we have much larger particles being born onto the screen here. And by contrast, if we drop this thing down to maybe 19, you'll see that the particles are now being born much smaller. Size randomness allows us to affect the variability in the size that these particles are born. So if we have a size randomness at 40, which is the default, we're going to see some particles born that are smaller than other particles. Now again, if we increase this size randomness up to be 100, we'll see a bunch of variability in terms of the size of the different particles that are being born. And by contrast to that, let's drop this size randomness down to 0, and we will see that most of these particles are being born at the same size. The birth and death color allow us to affect the color that these particles are born with and also die with. So the default is going to be this deep blue and then also this cyan color, but we can obviously change that to be something like purple, and let's make this, I don't even know, red, orange, cool. And as you can see, all of these particles then update with that birth and death color. Just like the random group inside of the generator group, we also have the random group inside of particle. And inside of this random group, we're able to control the lifespan randomness and the size randomness across all of these different splashes. And it works the same way as the generator randomness. The third and final group that we have access to a splash is going to be the physics group. And inside of here, we're able to use outside forces to act upon our particles. Those two outside forces being both gravity and resistance. So let's go ahead and let's increase gravity to be around 150. And automatically, you're going to see this gravity force pulling these particles towards the floor. If we play through our timeline here, you can really get a good idea of what's going on. Now we can obviously change the magnitude of that gravity by using the gravity property, and we can also change the angle of that gravity using the gravity angle. With resistance, we're able to introduce some sort of friction into our particle environments here. So let's go to a point in our timeline where these particles are really flying out of the original motion path here, and let's go to resistance and let's change this to be around 300. Now, as you can see, a lot of these particles have gone back to this original motion path, and that's because they are encountering some sort of resistance or some sort of friction when they are being launched from their original birthing point. Now, let's change this to 250, and I'll run through the timeline here to give you guys an idea of what this looks like. So as you can see, these particles are coming to a stop fairly quickly after they have been born because they are encountering that resistance or that friction. Well guys, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you have a solid grasp on what Splash is and how you can manipulate many of its different properties to get a wide variety of effects. There are so many applications for this effect, and we can't wait to see where it can be put to use. Have a great day, and this has been Danny with Plug and Play.